we have a lot of the theoretical components now in place, and hopefully the course is building a bit of a narrative or a bit of a story as like one way to make sense of the being of a person, or you know, how people come to think and feel and act in the ways that they do. We kind of, again, started with some basic you know, theoretical issues as it relates to the study of personality that we need to engage in some theorizing with regard to the abstractions and concepts that we use, the metaphors and so on. We are introducing some different modes of investigation, including empiricism, rationalism, and phenomenology. We have our model of causality that we want to kind of refer back to, just to try to get straight on the phenomena that we're trying to make sense of. We talked about you know, the material efficient causal emphasis that seems to be at play in much of mainstream psychology, and how in behaviorism it doesn't really kind of account for all the various introspective phenomena at work, and the idea that human beings are something analogous to you know, an algorithmic, you know, computational system just on a more complex level seems to be problematic for the reasons that we've talked about. In more recent lectures, we have tried to introduce this idea that the way of being of a person, characterized by like Dasein, being here, is such that we are thrown into a world. We are instantiated within a referential totality of, you know, of signs and symbols and ready-to-hand equipment that we take up, you know, without this sort of, you know, self-aware conceptual interpretive mode at work. That much of this recedes into the background, and we have this sort of tacit knowledge or know-how as it relates to our way of navigating within these social environments and responding to social affordances. You know, so an extended hand affords the possibility of a handshake, and, you know, certain distance standing practices, and all these things are just intuitively understood for anyone who is dwelling within this kind of sociocultural environment. And in the last couple of lectures, we have introduced mood and emotion as it relates to the way that we are in the world. So we are situated within a world, and such that our moods in particular, they ground us. It's like an atmosphere that we find ourselves within. It's not that there's a mood inside of our, you know, inner subjective minds or something like that. Like we just find ourselves in this way of being oriented within the world. It's almost like a compass that it directs you in a particular way, and it has the capacity of opening you up to, well, the world shows up in different ways depending on the mood that you're in, depending on how you're dialed into the world, how you're attuned to it. And so from there, we're always in a mood. We're never not in a mood. So even just subtle moods like, you know, apprehension or anticipation, and all these different variances in between. And then from there, emotions emerge that are more kind of contextual phenomena. They're holistic phenomena as well. So we have the what it's like of an emotion, but we also have like the behavioral parts, the whatever's going on a material efficient level in terms of our neurophysiology, you know, our interpretive, you know, kind of framing of a given situation. And that may lead us to experience or funnel us into particular kinds of moods. You can certainly kind of think your way into certain kinds of moods, or maybe out of, but into another mood. But there are also cases where moods just show up and are the ground floor. You're always in a mood of some sort. So this idea that we are this, you know, self-sufficient sort of referential kind of ego or something like that, and there's a world over there, like that whole Cartesian stuff that seems to be at work in the background of our theorizing in psychology, like that is arguably problematic. So mood is crucial. Mood and emotions are crucial in terms of how you're dialed into the world, and in a way like how you are and who you are in terms of what is revealed to you in your engagements with the world and with other people. And attachment theory has some important things to say in terms of why do people seem to have like certain characteristic moods or dispositions or familiar ways of being? What makes them open to certain kinds of emotions, closed off to other kinds of emotions? Attachment theory is going to help us out in that way. So just a quote by John Bowlby: "Mother love in infancy and childhood is as important for mental health as are vitamins and proteins for physical health." I would certainly agree with that. We're going to do just a quick little overview of some kind of basic things that you've probably been exposed to, and then we'll kind of layer some really complicated interpretations on top of this. How many people have, in previous courses, discussed briefly or in any depth attachment theory? How many people? Okay. So hopefully we will go a little bit beyond what you've been exposed to in other classes, and we'll link this up with personality. So as we know, we have we are predisposed in a way to make connections with other humans, our primary caregivers, that we have various evolved adaptations that orient us in this way, including reflexes, the grasping reflex. If you put your hand or finger on the palm of an infant, the infant will just reflexively grab hold. There's the rooting reflex. If you stroke the cheek of an infant, it will just instinctively turn toward the stroke and engage in suckling behavior. And that's to find the mother's breast and to be able to get milk. And various proximity-seeking behaviors, such as crying. And for most adults, for most parents, particularly for mothers, they just instinctively want to soothe and comfort that infant. So again, we can note the evolutionary significance of these kinds of more reflexive adaptations, that they provide protection, safety, and enhance our survival. But we also want to note, before we go further along, because this is kind of a layered phenomena that we're going to be talking about, that the evolutionary interpretations, they lend themselves to a material efficient causal explanation. But we shouldn't forget that while mechanisms are necessary and an important feature, they may be insufficient to account for the full phenomenon. And that's especially the case as we try to understand attachment as these so-called models or schemas as it relates to like yourself and who you are, and an understanding of other people and whether they're safe, reliable, and so on. This is going beyond just a mere material efficient causal process. So we want to keep in mind, at what level, or we can ask ourselves, what is the ontological status of this phenomena that we're looking at? Is it operating on more of a material efficient causal level? Is that the best way of explaining what's going on? Or is there a formal final causal process at work? Does that make sense? You guys with me on this? Okay. So John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth. Ainsworth had done some work with Bowlby, and she's made some significant contributions to attachment theory, mostly through the research involving the strange situation, which you might be familiar with, and we're going to talk about in a little bit. The idea is that we are innately disposed towards seeking out and forming attachments with others, where attachment describes the quality of the emotional relationship between the child and the primary caregiver, and later between adults. So we have attachment relationships in adulthood, much like we do in childhood. So you have, as adults, we have like close friends that we may share things with, that we may allow ourselves to be vulnerable in their presence, that we talk to for support and reassurance and comfort and that sort of thing. And certainly romantic relationships are kind of taking that to the next level. So it describes the quality of the emotional relationship, that there's an emotional involvement, that a concern with that a parent has ideally with the emotional well-being of a child. In short, it's how socio-emotional bonds or our being with others shape our personality. So this would be a good test question, like how would you define attachment? You want to have like a nuanced understanding of this. So it's not just simply, it's how humans bond, right? Well, what do you mean bond? Do you mean like super glue? Like what are we talking about here? No, we're talking about our emotional being with one another. And this is kind of a Heideggerian kind of term, but we're kind of keeping with that, some of that stuff, or putting a bit of that gloss on this. It's again one of these existentials, that our being with is a capacity of Dasein. We are always already with one another in our socio-cultural dwelling and our concern with one another in some way. So it's based, some of the early theorizing was based on child-parent observations, just watching like how children kind of interact with their mother or their father, the quality of those relationships, what happens, you know, as the mother or the father is present, what happens if they're separated briefly, you know, is the child able to, do they seem to be as comfortable or as reassured in the environment, or is there some uneasiness, or is there an apprehension that appears to come in, you know, in the absence of that primary caregiver? So there's arguably a shift in mood or disposition. And it's a developmental theory that links, so the past experience, our past learning, with our present functioning. So we want to keep in mind that this isn't just a learning at some conceptual level, right? Like a learning of ideas or beliefs or rules in some explicit way that we could declare to someone. This is more of an intuitive learning. I mean, it happens on that level too, especially as we mature, we get older. But the fundamental mode or level that this is operating on is more of an intuitive, you know, a visceral kind of, you know, a ready-to-hand sort of way of being with others and responding to various social affordances, often without realizing. So we develop these ways of relating to one another without having some explicit understanding of how that came to be or what it's about. So it's a lifespan account of human emotional development, so how we come to regulate our emotions, how we come to understand our emotions, and you know, sort of what we expect in terms of relating to others, especially in adulthood, vis-a-vis our emotions. So if you do not appreciate how emotion regulation plays into the regulation of moods and emotions, if you don't appreciate how that plays into attachment theory, I would say that you don't really understand attachment theory, because that's a huge, huge part of this. So some of the key ideas in infancy and childhood, there's this notion of a secure base, where a caregiver provides a secure and dependable base for the child to then explore the world. Secure in the sense that there's this intuitive understanding that the parent is there to offer protection, is there to offer reassurance and guidance if need be, and comfort if there's, you know, some distressing issue that comes up. And dependable in the sense that, you know, as far as the child's experiences, it just has this intuitive, again, this intuitive understanding that the parent is always there if needed. And so the parent functions in a way as a secure haven. So the child will look to the caregiver for comfort and soothing if they're upset and distressed. And again, this is based on a familiarity with this parent, and we're describing like an ideal kind of secure attachment dynamic, where the child, you know, if they're distressed and the parent is present, it's like the parent provides like a social, you know, affordance that solicits the behavior of the child trying to find the parent or connect with them in some way. There's proximity maintenance in the sense that the child strives to stay safe by keeping close to the caregiver. Now this changes a little bit, you know, after 2 years of age. It may vary a little bit, or there's less of that concern. And there's generally a separation distress. So when separated, the child becomes upset or distressed. Again, this sort of, by 2.5 years of age, this kind of peters out a little bit. But so when the child is not able to find the parent, that there's, you know, some anxiety, some worry, and then a concern about reconnecting with the parent. So it's a goal-directed partnership. In other words, a healthy relationship will correct for threats to proximity. So in other words, if you have a toddler, a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old, and they're, you take them to the playground and you say, go have fun, go climb the ladder, go use the little slide or whatever, and they go and they run off, and you're sitting on the bench and you're watching them. At a certain point, if there's all kinds of kids on the playground and you lose sight of your kid, how is the parent likely to feel, or what's likely to happen? Stress. There's some anxiety, there's some apprehensiveness that kind of creeps in, and then there's a concern about, ensuring that they can catch sight of their kid, make sure that they're okay and whatnot. And similarly, if the parent gets up off the bench and they go a few meters over in this direction and they talk to another parent, let's say, and if the child is playing and then looks over and doesn't see the parent, they can't find the parent, they will become, usually a bit panicky or apprehensive, and they might call out to the parent just to make sure that the parent is there. And initially, there's a parent-mediated affect regulation in these secure relationships. So again, we are not born in a way that we can regulate our emotions effectively on our own. Arguably, even in adulthood, various emotions, we are not good at doing that. That's just not, the kind of being that we are. So a parent is there to help, regulate the distressing feelings. And again, by regulation, what we mean is being able to tolerate this emotion without being totally overwhelmed by it to the point of dysregulation, and without having to, engage in various behaviors to detach from the experience. So parents help regulate emotions through all kinds of things, including, eye contact, tone of voice, comforting touch, and so on. And as development proceeds, greater autonomy for self-regulation shifts to the child. So you can imagine that when a parent has this sort of way of being with the child, kind of develops a capacity for being able to regulate their emotions more effectively on their own, and they can, get a bit more distance from the parent. They can explore the world, with greater confidence. And if something happens and, they kind of scrape their knee a little bit, or, something happens with a friend and they're feeling momentarily disappointed a little bit, they can tolerate that feeling without having a meltdown, without being overwhelmed by it. And they can kind of collect themselves at least long enough that they can come back to the parent if they need to. So it allows for, exploratory behavior. As children get a little bit older, they get more confident, and, they're able to go to sleepovers at friends' houses. You go to the park, you go to the zoo, they're able to kind of wander off a little bit and explore things and gain mastery in how they test out various abilities and even talk to other people that are not immediate family members. So from this framework, the idea is that early attachment-related experiences create internal working models of self, of oneself, one's perceived competence, one's lovability, and a model or an understanding of the other person, whether they are, a possible threat, whether they are a safe place to go to for reassurance or comfort, whether they're likely to be responsive, and so on. Now, I have internal working models in scare quotes. Can anyone intuit why just that phrasing might be just a little bit questionable from the framework that we've been building on here? Yeah, so it does seem to encourage, internal. What does internal mean? Do you mean in the head, in the mind or something like that? What does internal involve? So we get into this internal, external kind of, subject-object type thing, perhaps. And when we talk about a working model, well, a working model for whom? For the child? The child has this inner representation of a model or something like that, a conceptual framing, that is manifest to kind of self-aware consciousness or something? I don't think so. I don't think that's what we're after here. I think later in life you can try to do some of that, and through a lot of therapy you can have some understanding of some of these various schemes that you appear to be operating on. But again, I think a lot of this is operating more on an intuitive, visceral, tacit knowledge or understanding based on a prior familiarity and way of being with others. So again, these models are tacit, they're largely unconscious. We're not aware that we're sort of engaging in this way of relating to people. It sort of recedes into the background of our everyday activity, and it's embedded in emotional memory and intuitive know-how based on a prior familiarity with the world, with our moods and emotions, and with other people. So I feel like I can't stress that enough, that, you know, again, you just think about an infant or a young child, they have yet to, you know, take on language in a way that would allow them to deal in abstractions, right? And, you know, just because we can do that quite readily, or, you know, especially as we're engaging in our educational pursuits, like we imagine that that's our primary way of being. It is not. It is built atop like another more visceral, intuitive way of being. And again, we are always grounded in our moods that reveal the world and reveal kind of possibilities for social interaction in a particular way. And we'll see how that plays out. So the idea is that attachment schemas are organized along pathways that were adaptive in our early development. And this tends to shape our later social experiences in consistent ways. So in other words, if you grow up in an environment where you have, you know, a parent that has like a hot temper, you know, and it doesn't take them much to get set off. Now, intuitively on some level, a child is going to have some apprehensiveness or anxiety about that parent. And they may deal with that by being extremely passive, or, you know, they engage in a kind of walking on eggshells around that parent. They may engage in a great deal of self-censorship in a way to just be adaptive. And why is that adaptive? Because if they were to, you know, get upset or angry with the parent or something like that, that would lead to potentially like an awful situation. So they get into this pattern or this way of relating to this parent that is adaptive. It involves arguably inhibiting a lot of their own you know, kind of thoughts or feelings about what's going on. And then later in life, these dynamics seem to repeat themselves in the sense that, you know, if someone comes along into your life like that manifests in a way similar to that hot-tempered parent, it doesn't strike you as odd or threatening, or, you know, something to just be ejected out of your life. There's almost like a familiarity with it, and it creates this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy in a way. There's also the way, of course, in which, like, if we are on the receiving end of a great deal of criticism from a parent, we tend to talk to ourselves in the way that we were spoken to. And so we develop this sort of, or we could develop like a kind of punitive way of engaging with ourselves that can create a lot of problems that we'll talk about. More of a Heideggerian spin on this is that the social affordances within that relational context set up a mood-based disposition, again, this apprehensiveness that creeps in, and a mode of comportment, a mode of directing yourself, you know, toward the situation or in the situation based on this prior familiarity with this parent, which then determines an openness or a closing off from the world, other emotions and moods and people. So the strange situation. So this is based on the work of Mary Ainsworth, and what would happen is researchers would observe infants roughly aged 12 to 18 months in a situation during interactions with the parent when they're left alone with the researcher, so the parent leaves the room, and then they would observe how the child responds to that. There may be, you know, a phase where the child is left entirely on their own, but then they're reunited with the mother, and they would look at how the child responds to the return of the mother. Now there's a lot of speak about mothers in this, and I feel like, you know, certainly children can develop, you know, profound attachments with a father as well. So they identified 4 different attachment styles, that there's ways of being or ways of relating between the child and the primary caregiver. They characterize as a secure attachment, an avoidant attachment, an anxious, ambivalent attachment, and a disorganized attachment. We're going to talk about all of those in some depth. But first we're going to watch a video. Now this video, has anyone seen any videos on the strange situation? Yeah. So this video I can almost guarantee you that you have not seen because it is so old and it's almost comical in a way, but I feel like well, just because of the music, you'll probably chuckle when you hear it, but it gives like a really good illustration of some of these dynamics that we're talking about. And I think it's about 15 minutes long, so we'll just kind of check that out here.
By the end of the first year, all human infants, however treated, have formed an attachment to persons who care for them. Such attachments are strongly based in our biology. However, the nature of these first relationships, their quality, is based upon experience. Some infants have learned to expect that their caregivers will be available to them. They have learned to signal their needs and to anticipate the caregiver's responsiveness. This knowledge is an important source of security. Knowing that the caregiver will respond when called for and will take effective action when needed, the infant has the necessary support for exploring with confidence the objects and people of the world. After all, if the infant does encounter something upsetting, she or he can seek contact and will find that contact reassuring. As Eva is doing, securely attached infants can explore freely in the caregiver's presence. The caregiver is a base of security for exploring the novel world. Eva's confident expectations are obvious. There may be occasional looks to the mother or sharing of play, but the business at hand is learning about the object world. Based upon hundreds of hours of observing infants in their own homes, Dr. Mary Ainsworth of the University of Virginia has devised a highly valid laboratory procedure for assessing the quality of this vital relationship and how it serves the infant. We have used this procedure in our work here at Minnesota. Basically, the objective is to determine how effectively and flexibly the attachment behavior is organized. That is, how well it works for the infant. 4 major criteria are involved. Does the infant readily become engaged in exploration in the caregiver's presence, and is the quality of play influenced by the comings and goings of the caregiver? Following a brief separation, during which the infant was not distressed, is the infant active in greeting and seeking interaction with the caregiver? When distressed by separation, is the infant active in seeking contact with the caregiver? And is this contact effective in alleviating the distress? When distressed, negative feelings should not interfere with contact seeking. In general, the more distressed the infant, the more active he or she should be in using the caregiver as a source of reassurance. But however distressed, this reassurance should be effective. In Ainsworth's procedure, the infant is viewed in a situation of increasing stress, so the way the infant adjusts his or her behavior may be seen. In the first episode, the infant is brought into a novel room and introduced to a set of attractive toys. The stress here is modest. We note Eva's ease of separating and becoming engaged with the toys. The second episode, like all of the following episodes, lasts 3 minutes. It begins when Eva's mother sits in her chair. We look at the quality of the play and exploration. Eva shows a high level of systematic involvement. Episode 3 begins when a stranger enters. She sits quietly for 1 minute, and then will chat with the mother for another minute.
Not really, not the eggs. But she loves music, so. Okay, she's just going to walk, but she's distressed. Would she rather call you right now, or would she still? Well, or hasn't she been distressed since she started walking?
She's been distressed, yeah.
In the final minute, the stranger tries to engage Eva in play. The secure infant typically would not be unduly wary of the stranger, and, given the presence of the caregiver, frequently will be quite accepting of her.
Good girl. I know, modeling things can be fun. Cute.
In the 4th episode, the caregiver will leave. This is stressful for most 12-month-olds. Eva shows that she does not want the separation by shaking her head.
Good girl.
Other infants, or even Eva in other circumstances, may be quite upset by this separation, and may even cry.
No, I bet that you can even play by yourself. Yeah.
I'll just sit up here.
Oh, I'll stay right here, okay?
Eva shows her distress through subdued play and minor signs of tension. Note the tense movement of her arm. Not being acutely distressed, on this occasion, Eva will not require physical contact when her mother returns in episode 5. But she shows her pleasure at mother's return with an enthusiastic greeting.
Not that, it's Mama.
What you doing?
You have an egg curtain. Oh. Everything's okay.
And the quality of her play improves notably. When mother departs again, episode 6, this time leaving Eva alone, the stress is greatly increased. Eva is clearly upset. Eva's mother can see her on closed-circuit TV from the adjoining room. If either she or the researchers feel that Eva will not settle herself, this period will be cut short, as was done in this case. Instead of the expected mother, the stranger returns in episode 7. Eva's disappointment is obvious. She does not seek to be picked up, and while she accepts contact with the stranger, the contact is not fully effective. She settles some, but the settling will not be complete.
Yeah.
However friendly she may have been with the stranger prior to separation, the stranger cannot substitute for the caregiver now. Her delight upon Mother's return makes obvious the specialness of this relationship. The stranger leaves unobtrusively so as not to interfere with the reunion. Again, being somewhat settled, Eva requires rather little physical contact. She does, however, interact more with her mother during this final episode. And she seeks to be near her. Other secure babies may have needed more contact than this, and in other circumstances, Eva may have also. The important thing is that they seek the contact they need. What would Eva do if stressed further? To illustrate this, we had Eva's mother leave a third time, solely for the purposes of this film. Predictably, Eva was very upset. This was hard on both mother and child, and we would never routinely do this. It is not part of the Ainsworth procedure. Mother returned after 20 seconds, and Eva's desire for contact was clear. Even though she had been thoroughly distressed, she settles quickly in her mother's arms, in stark contrast to her behavior with the stranger. She puts her arms around her mother's neck and draws their bodies close together. She relaxes completely. This was predictable from her greetings, her interaction, and play when she was not upset. This is clearly a special relationship.
Okay, so just make sure everyone's paying attention. The video clip that we just saw, was that a securely attached infant, or yes? Okay. What are some comments or things that you noticed in the video, things that might have jumped out at you as significant or interesting? What do we notice about the quality of Eva's playing with the toys when the mother was present versus the mother being out of the room? Right, so when the mother is present, Eva is far more animated. Her movements seem more fluid right? And when the mother is not there, what do you notice in the movements? She becomes more restricted in her movements, and arguably, like it looks like she's there's some tension there in her body movements, right? And so what can happen is that when tension kind of comes in at that age, you kind of lose some fine motor control ability. Yeah, and what did you notice? So the mother left the room, and that part where the researcher comes back into the room to comfort Eva. What do you notice there? Is Eva happy that the researcher is going to comfort her? Right. Well, it's almost like if I mean, you could speculate that a child that has like a healthy, secure attachment dynamic, they're able to regulate their emotions a little bit more effectively than a child that doesn't have a secure attachment. And so they're able to kind of accept a little bit of that reassurance from a stranger in a way that maybe an insecurely attached, or at least certain kinds of insecurely attached infants would not. We're going to run through, again, like in as much detail as we can, just to be really clear on what's going on here, a secure attachment dynamic. So we're exploring the relationship between the child and the primary caregiver and what that looks like. And so what happens is that a secure attachment seems to be the result of a caregiver who is emotionally available. And so, in other words, you have like you imagine like the psychology or the personality of the parent there has to be an openness to emotion. There has to be an openness to the appropriate moods that would allow them to even notice what the child is experiencing and have some kind of appropriate reaction viscerally to that response. So they're available. They're perceptive. They notice that there's something not quite right, or that there's the possibility of an infant or a child needing some additional comfort, and they're responsive. So because of those things, they tend to act in a way that is appropriate and reassuring to the child. And they're able to regulate the child's anxiety or distress or emotions and what have you. The child then feels secure, the child feels comforted, and in these kind of dynamics, there's a minimal level of distress when separated from the parent. And effectively, the child is just assured through just repetition, just through that familiarity with that parent, that the parent, of course, is going to come back. They are consistent in that way. If they're distressed, they will seek comfort from caregivers, and they feel assured that the caregiver will provide it. I'm going to maybe walk through just a bit of a narrative story for how we might think about what's going on here, and just to highlight some things that are maybe at work here. We'll talk about again, this is the ideal case. So a securely attached dynamic seems to occur roughly, between 50 and 60% of the population, the non-clinical population, right? So only 50, 60% of us grow up, in a way that is characterized by secure attachments with our primary caregivers. And by no means, I should say, does an insecure attachment dynamic, by no means is that like pathological or anything like that, although it would put you at higher risk of having mental health related issues. So if we go back to, when a child comes into the world, the parent is there, of course, to provide, physical safety and security through, they offer, food and water and shelter and things like that, but they're also able to provide for them emotionally. If we imagine an infant, say 2-3 months of age, and the infant is crying in a crib, how would a parent move? So assuming that we have a parent who is kind of dialed into the world in the appropriate way, there's an openness to their moods or to their emotions, they feel something about what the child is or what they perceive to be happening with the child, what would be an appropriate way? Like, how do parents who are in a good way with themselves, how would they comfort that child? So the child is in the crib, what would happen? Just walk me through it. Yeah.
Go to the crib, speak in like a kind of soothing voice.
Okay.
Pick the child up, hug the child, just kind of caress the head and the back.
Okay. So we might pick the child up, and we so we hold the child close, right? So we're not holding them out here like this, holding them close. Can we imagine like how, like just the, so if the parent is extremely stressed and frustrated and so on, can we imagine how that would affect what happens there, what's going on there? Right? Like if the parent is like carrying all this tension and stress in their body, that it might not be as effective in soothing the state of that infant. So ideally we have a parent that's relatively kind of relaxed and in a calm state. We have that soothing tone that we speak in relation to the infant. Now, do you ever notice like or think about like when a child is like, I don't know if you've been around like little babies and children recently, but if they're really dysregulated and they're just like they're just crying at the top of their lungs, like do parents typically go in and say, "Oh, they're there, I'll take care of you, come here." Do they talk in like a meek little tone like that? Like how would they initially approach that in their tone, in the quality of their voice? Right. Well, I don't see if you guys agree with me here. Like I think like when a child is really dysregulated, I think without realizing it, when a parent initially comes in, they come in with a really heightened quality of voice, like, "Oh, they're there, it's okay. And we had this sort of excited kind of, it's almost like we're meeting them at their level at first, and then we gradually like, "It's all right, it's okay." And then we kind of, regulate that tone in sync with, the child's disposition. Yeah, go ahead.
I think also in
Your voice?
Yeah.
Kind of to get above the level of their...
Yeah, they have to hear you. You got to project. Yeah. I remember my oldest, when she would get really unsettled, it'd be really hard to kind of settle her down. And to this point, like the sort of bouncy thing, like the only thing that would seem to work, or at least seem to work for me, was that I would do this really intense like walking lunges, and there'd be like there'd have to be that drop that kind of happens, like just a little bit, and while singing like 99 bottles of beer on the wall, whatever reason that seemed to work for her, but you kind of match the intensity of where the child is at, and you kind of bring that down to a more kind of modulated kind of state. What are we doing? What else are we doing? So we talked about the tone, we talked about the body. What else is happening? Like your physical movements, what else is happening? Really important thing. So if you imagine like, okay, so we're going to make Brad do this thing, so we pick up the baby, we're kind of relaxed, we bring the infant close to us, we try to match the intensity. What else? Trying to give you some clues right now. Yeah, eye contact, yeah? Right? We didn't talk about that yet, I don't think. So eye contact is very, very important. There's all kinds of really interesting studies that demonstrate just how crucial a parent-child that eye contact is in regulating internal distress. So we don't want to forget that piece. So there's this kind of soothing that happens with this parent who's in this way with a child that is able to be regulated, and most children can, through these kinds of things. And we can imagine, again, what's happening on a material efficient causal analysis, right? We can speculate, along the lines of Jaak Panksepp, or if you're curious about this sort of thing, Alan Shore's work on this stuff is absolutely fascinating. It's very, very technical and very complicated, but he talks about the orbital frontal cortex and how that's involved in affect regulation and so on. We can talk about, the release of oxytocin and endogenous opiates and that sort of thing. But at another level, there's a really basic level that's just kind of good to keep in mind is Hebb's axiom: neurons that fire together wire together, right? So you're creating these functional neural networks or connections, and if you imagine that an infant is in a state of neural dysregulation or something like that, and a parent picks them up and moves their state from a mode of dysregulation into a more regulated internal state. And we imagine that happening not just once, but repeatedly over and over again. What's happening is that infant's nervous system is kind of developing in a way to more effectively kind of move from a state of distress to a state of relative equanimity. And early on, the parent is needed to do that, but arguably as the child matures, they can do that a little bit more effectively on their own. So again, let's stick with this example. So we have, this is what's happening in infancy. So then we fast forward and things start to get really complicated. So let's just even go to the level of a toddler, right? So a toddler is, walking around and kind of holding on to things, and they're learning language, but just in the beginning phase of it, and their receptive language is far more developed than their expressive language. They understand way more than they're able to say. And so if we imagine a toddler who is upset or feeling sad or lonely or left out or something like that, what happens is something similar. So a parent will usually kind of go down on one knee at eye level. Again, the eye contact is crucial. We use that soothing, nurturing tone of voice. They might put a comforting arm around them. But what's added to this is that a parent is, tenaciously curious about the emotional state of the child, and so the parent is asking questions like, are you upset because your sister took your toy away? Are you, really hurt because you got left out? The other two kids got to play together and you didn't get to play. Are you angry because, we promised that we would play this game tonight and we didn't realize how late it got, and now there's not time to play? It'd be okay if you were angry. Is it this? Is it that? And it's almost like a parent that has this sort of intuitive capacity to wonder about the psychological states of a child. The child is hearing this sort of stuff. They have some dim familiarity with the words, but they haven't necessarily applied them to themselves. When a parent, plays this wondering game about what's going on and hits the mark, the child feels like the parent gets it in that moment, and it provides them with the emotional language to now label their experiences, so that if this happens a lot, they become really good at communicating what they're feeling. Children who don't have this sort of thing have a very limited emotional vocabulary. You ask them how they're doing or what they're feeling, and it's almost like it's limited to good and not good, right? They don't have that nuanced understanding or appreciation of different emotional states or moods that they might be experiencing. But in addition to all of that, so there's this language, there's this, symbolic connecting with these, subjective experiences. But more important than that, let's take sadness. When a child is feeling sad, they're experiencing this sadness, and if a parent is really in tune with what's going on with that child, what is the parent feeling? Sad. Sad in what way?
Like you're unable to help the child, so you're like feeling sad because you can't, you're not like competent enough to kind of help out there.
Okay, this is where it gets really tricky. So that would be the not good kind of sadness, and I'll explain briefly why. If a parent is feeling upset, like oh gosh, I can't help this kid, or they're so sad, and I wish I could just fix this and make it go away. What happens is that the parent is now becoming a bit dysregulated, and it's in relation to them, and it makes it very difficult for them to be present with what the child is feeling, right? And the child will pick up on that distress of the parent, and they will, intuitively, inhibit some of their own emotional response so that they don't, cause any problems for the parent. This is not a good thing. But ideally, the parent is experiencing sadness for the child, right? And there's this beautiful thing where if this happens in the right way, that the child is able to look into the eyes of the parent. This is why eye contact is so important, the facial expressions, and they can literally see themselves mattering to another person. And they can experience their emotions manifesting within, this attuned connection. And there's something about all of that that makes these emotional states that are almost unbearable in isolation, they now become bearable as they're co-regulated in that way. And just to complicate things even further, now you have an intuitive understanding of yourself as a person worth caring about, right? That you matter in some significant way, and it adds to your intuitive sense of your value and your self-concept and all that sort of thing. So there's just all kinds of different layers happening here in a very complicated way. Does that make sense? So, is there anything else I want to say about that? I'll just say briefly, we'll focus more next time on, how this looks at the adult level. We'll just mention briefly a few things, but so children who have these kinds of experiences with at least one primary caregiver, they tend to become adults who have, awareness of what they're experiencing. They're able to label their experiences, and they just intuitively, if they're feeling unsettled or overwhelmed, they will just intuitively reach out to other people and talk about their experience, and they will expect that other people will care, especially anyone who has the privilege of calling themselves a friend, right, or certainly a romantic partner. So that's kind of how that works. Well, we have about 5 minutes left, and I worry that that's not going to be enough time for us to really kind of venture into the insecure attachment styles. So maybe we might park that until next class. Okay, so office hours after class, if anyone has anything they want to hash out or talk about, and have a good reading break. We'll see you back here after that.